Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to the panel about bias and fairness in AI. And I will introduce you our panelists. So the first panelist is Timnit Gebru. She's a research scientist and technical co-lead of the ethical AI team at Google. She just finished her postdoc at Microsoft Research, New York City, in the FATE, Fairness, Transparency, Accountability, and Ethics in AI group, where she studied algorithmic bias and the ethical implication underlying any data mining project. Our second panelist is Margaret Mitchell. She is a senior research scientist and leads the ethic AI team within Google Research. Her research is interdisciplinary, combining computer vision, natural language processing, statistical methods, deep learning, and cognitive science, and she applies her work in clinical and assistive domains. And our last panelist is Brittney Sanders. She is Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Initiative at the New York Commission of Human Rights. At the Commission, Brittney managed key interagency partnership and special projects related to data-driven discrimination and racial justice, among others. And before joining the Commission, Brittney worked for the Office of the Mayor, most recently as acting counsel to the Mayor. So now that we properly introduced our speakers, I will start with some questions, and then you could come and ask your questions to the panelists. So first, AI has an increasingly important role in human affairs. Some professions increasingly use it to assist in their decision-making or even let it take decisions on its own. How do we define fairness and bias? Knowing the answer of this question might determine how some industries or institutions will operate in the future. So who wants to start?
I can start. Is this on? Sorry? I have to turn it on?
Oh, keep talking.
Hello. Okay, I'll keep talking and then it turns on. Okay, I don't know how to use technology. So I will let them answer the hard questions, but I'll say that I don't know how to define fairness personally, but I know when we see unfairness sometimes, and I think that's what's easier to define. And I think I've heard even Meg say that if we ground it in human rights and if we ground it in other types of legalities, that because the legal system sometimes has defined these things for us, then we might get to a better definition. So I'll let you guys talk about it. But the one thing I want to say is that I think, especially Meg and I, one of our sticking points is when people want to work abstractly on fairness or bias without either interacting with the communities that are that are being unfairly, that are being negatively impacted by these algorithms, or they're like write papers and you have like in your motivation you could be like, oh, gender bias is bad, or African Americans they deal with X, Y, and Z, and you've never worked with an African American or a woman, you've never collaborated with them, or you've never talked to someone. Like yesterday at Black in AI, we brought Terrence in, who was unfairly treated. He was the victim of these crime recidivism risk assessment scores, right? And most people who work on this kind of stuff, they have never interacted with someone like him. So what I would say is that when we think about bias and fairness like this, we shouldn't think about it in the abstract definitional sense, but we should make sure to work with the communities that are dealing with these things and make sure that their voices are lifted. Their voices are also on the papers and on the fame and glory, and not just our careers being built on that kind of misery. And now you can define fairness.
Oh, I think we each have. Actually, we have our own mics. We're lousy with microphones here.
Okay.
Is this coming through okay? Is it? Okay, cool. So yeah, there's I think a lot of definitions of fairness and bias in how we use the words colloquially in conversation, and there's a lot of definitions of fairness and bias in sort of statistical domains, and there is oftentimes a disconnect between the conversation and colloquial usage of these terms and some of the more mathematical and statistical usages of these terms. I know that we're talking about bias and fairness sort of within the machine learning context, which largely draws from and is inspired by the colloquial usages, but can be somewhat detached from it, and at times even sort of defined in such a way that it might further propagate issues of bias and unfairness. So to give an example, a lot of machine learning definitions of fairness focus on things like parity, so getting equal error rates or whatever sort of evaluation metric is relevant across different subgroups. Whereas when we talk about fairness generally, sort of in colloquial usage, we're thinking about things more like justice, we're thinking about things more like rights, and there can be a disconnect there in what we're defining mathematically. And actually, historically, fairness has had other surges, other kinds of bubbles in statistical worlds, and died out in part because it sort of got detached from how words like fairness were being used legally and colloquially. Oh, and I have a paper on this also, as does Shira Mitchell, who's also in the audience. But I try and bridge the gap as much as I can. And so when I'm talking about bias and fairness in machine learning, I'm talking about stereotyping, I'm talking about prejudice, I'm talking about racism, I'm talking about sexism. And that means everything from who is asking the questions, who's starting to develop the technology, to the data sets that are collected, to the machine learning models, to the outcomes. It's the whole end-to-end system that is a part of this. I think in machine learning we tend to get really excited about machine learning models and then lose ourselves in how we can define fairness and bias in the context of machine learning models. But there's so much to do at the level of data, and there's so much to do at the level of who's even working on this. And so also to Timnit's point, it's a little bit frustrating to see work on fairness and inclusion that's largely majority demographic groups working together. And you're missing the larger picture because all of your choices are now informed by shared life experiences, missing critical knowledge, diverse perspectives, critical knowledge that you don't have from people who are less represented in your domain. So that's a long way of saying there are lots of definitions, and part of, I think, what all of us are interested in doing is making sure that the usage of fairness and bias terms in statistics and in machine learning is very closely tied to what people mean colloquially when they say those things.
Please read The History of Fairness, written by Ben Hutchinson and Meg Mitchell. I think this is one of the most important papers that I have seen in our community, so it's out this year. She's really bad at publicizing her work, so.
That's, I think all of that is great, and I second a lot of what both Timnit and Meg said. So I would say that so a little bit of background, the New York City Commission on Human Rights is a local government agency in New York City that enforces our anti-discrimination law. And so I think from that perspective, to Timnit's point, looking at making sure that we're grounded and connected to the legal concepts that are relevant, in that context, we think about discrimination as differential treatment based on one's membership in a protected category. Our law is very broad, so we have something like 24 different categories of protection across our 3 different areas of jurisdiction, or 3 major areas of jurisdiction, which are housing, employment, and public accommodations. And then we also have jurisdiction over something called discriminatory harassment, which is harassment you might, targeting for violence and intimidation in public spaces. And then also we have jurisdiction over something called bias-based profiling by law enforcement. So in that sense, it is this differential treatment based on your membership in a protected class, and that might be kind of direct or it might be indirect because a particular group of people is more likely to be impacted by a policy or a practice that appears to be neutral. But before I came to the commission and came to local government, I worked in racial justice advocacy at a couple different organizations. And so I'd like to place that kind of anti-discrimination framework in the broader framework of kind of structural inequity and, paying attention to like our long histories of racism and sexism and ableism and all the things that are needed now to make sure that folks get justice and to make sure that people can thrive moving forward. So it's kind of all nested in one space, but I absolutely second a lot of what was said in addition.
Can I give a very quick example? So for example, let's say this conference, right now all the visa issues we've been having have been on the news, right? So imagine if like a particular group of people were organizing, let's say, this workshop, AI for Social Good, or a fairness and bias and fairness workshop. There was absolutely no Africans involved. People would have no idea the kind of hurdles that everybody else had to go through to come here, and the fact that they can't even come here. So what does it mean to have a conversation about bias and fairness when the people who are experiencing hurdles are not even at the table? Right, so this is why it's super important, what Meg said. We have to think of it as an end-to-end system. It's not just the math and whatever. It's also, it has to start from the very beginning.
So now that we kind of define what's bias and fairness, so as we know, there is bias in the way AI software analyzes the world, and it can thus result in serious consequences for people, even if the technology is at an early stage. And so my question is, what are some of the biases that could impact people in this way in the next few years and in the next few decades? So if you could give some...
I'm thinking, Brittney, maybe want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think some of the things that we think about and that actually initially drew our interest at the Commission to issues of algorithmic bias were really around, one, realizing that that AI was increasingly being used in the decision-making that we had, traditionally been looking at in those three major areas of decision-making. And then also thinking about, like, well, what if we know that that these models are trained using data, then we ought to be curious about what the sources of those data are and what sorts of biases might be baked in. So, the human rights law has basically evolved to address different forms of discrimination as they manifest, and so that means that I think we're kind of naturally curious about how the kind of long history of discrimination is reflected in the data that that folks are using, and then I guess replicated through the models that develop out of that. And then also, I think there are some more kind of nitty-gritty specific questions that we would have around, like, what do we know, not just about what do we know about certain types of data that might function as proxies for or certain types of data that might include categories that then function as proxies for our protected categories? What do we know about certain like data sources, right, that may frankly have low quality data or be prone to mistakes, and then what are the impacts of those for real people?
Yeah, I second a lot of all those points. The idea around data and then that biases in the data further getting propagated through the system and then at times even amplified, it's useful to point out that that also causes a feedback loop. So the kinds of information you get is biased in a certain way, and then you select among that information, and then that sends a signal back that is used as data that is retrained. So this is like a pretty problematic cycle once you start seeing it, which is I think why people that are traditionally computer scientists are more and more turning towards fairness and bias, because once your systems start working and you start to see how they work, there's a lot of, oh crap, maybe I don't want to continue developing this, and the feedback loop problem especially is really problematic, and the fact that a lot of the technology right now is being developed by like economically very well-developed countries, a lot of people who are, computer scientists at top tech companies, like also come from sort of privileged backgrounds, and so that is causing a kind of myopia in what gets developed and what gets launched that then is spread throughout the world. And I think Timnit will maybe also hopefully say this point about the homogeneity effect of this, but I just also want to say that I think talking about AI as a full system, a full end-to-end system, I think another massive bias right now is the launch, the pressure to launch. There's this idea of just, like, launching is always good. And part of why that is true is because that's how you're evaluated in tech companies. Like, how many launches have you made? That's what's incentivized. And so I think one of the most challenging biases that we're already seeing effects of now that hopefully won't continue that much, but probably will, is just this idea that any technology is cool to develop and you should develop it and you should release it. And here I'm talking about face detection. Here I'm talking about gender prediction, right? Like, it's really hard to work inside a corporation and say, okay, we might have a system that can do really well at this based on our data set, and also we should not release it. And that's a massive, you're fighting against a huge cultural bias at that point. You're also fighting against capitalism. And so I think that is this underlying bias, like we have to release stuff, things have to go out. That is a really, really difficult challenge right now.
So maybe I'll give some examples of the biases that have had real-world impacts. So one example is hiring, and so a lot of there's all these different companies popping up. So the issue is that there are all of these different companies doing all sorts of things that we just sort of just find out about every week or so, right? So there's no like FDA or whatever approval process. The Food and Drug Administration, at least, like if you're going to develop a drug or something, you have to go through some sort of approval process. But if you have algorithms that are supposed to decide some aspect of your life, you don't go through any sort of approval process. We have absolutely no idea what the model looks like, what your training data is. We don't have standards, etc. So a few examples for these there are these hiring companies. Man, I got contacted by the PR people from HireVue because I keep on giving them as an example. But I will give them an example again. So the thing is, HireVue is not the only one, but it's one of these largest companies that they have over 600 customers. So over 600 large companies ranging from Nike to all sorts of tech companies. Some of the largest, right? Procter & Gamble, I think, is one of them. 600 companies, multinational, international companies, right? So HireVue's selling point is that, so they do claim, so what they do is, one of the things they do is that, imagine as a company you have thousands and thousands of resumes coming in, and you don't want to hire, have lots of recruiters going through these resumes one by one to figure out who to have in an interview, etc., right? So what they do is they have this automated tool to screen out people based on their resumes or other applications. We don't know anything about the characteristics of this tool. They're not required to tell us what it does, or they just offer it to all these different companies. It might as well, they do claim that but after using their tools, that some companies had more diverse work groups, people, but that might be true, that might not be true. We have no idea. And then, so they have this tool, and then once you interview, okay, you're having an interview, they have this tool where they record you in the interview. And then when they're advertising it, they say, from the recording, people get verbal and nonverbal cues about you. So it's okay, I'm getting interviewed, and now there's and then I found out, I didn't even know how they were doing this in another panel with Rana, that they were using Affectiva to do emotion recognition. So I'm sitting in an interview now with this emotion recognition thing on me. I don't know how well that emotion recognition thing works. What if it thinks that Brittney's always mad? Right. Even if so we have absolutely no idea what the characteristics of these tools are. And now, and I know people who went through this whole hire review process who didn't even have any idea that emotion recognition was being done on them as they're interviewing. And so they didn't, and so like imagine we have a few of these, capitalism, right? Like a few of these companies like with massive reaches, making lots of money. And imagine if hire review is being used not just in the US, but in Ethiopia and like all over the world. And now you have like this single failure point. And if there is some characteristic that I have that people don't like, or there's something going on, I could get rejected from all jobs everywhere, right? So I think these are the day-to-day kind of things that we have to watch out for.
To some extent, we can say that bias in AI can reflect the programming that it designed in it, and also the data that are used to design it. And it can even reinforce previously existing human bias, as Brittney told us, and grant it perceived legitimacy. So what could we do to change the way AI software is designed to prevent this bias from taking over and having unintended consequences? And in what way could AI potentially change culture and mindset, either constructively or negatively? So maybe Brittney.
I mean, one thought, perhaps selfishly from my end, is that I think it would, there's a lot that I'd say the Commission don't necessarily understand about how these are developed, and even with respect to the very specific question of the degree to which folks are researching or understanding or exploring human rights laws and civil rights laws, particularly as they're developing these. So I think maybe a greater openness to that sort of conversation and a little bit of that transparency would be really helpful. And I think to echo a point that's come up in a lot of the conversations I've been a part of this weekend, and certainly in yesterday's keynote by Terrence and the following panel, was to Timnit's point, right, making sure that you're not developing in a vacuum, and that you have an opportunity to hear from folks who have been impacted, or who, and may not, folks who have interacted with the systems that you're designing the tool for, and who can tell you, this is not some fresh landscape with no history. Let me tell you about what I experienced, and other folks can talk about some of the broader landscape of what the experience has been with those systems, to give a little context.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I kind of want to build on that as well to say, I think there's sort of a focus in people who develop machine learning technology on what the user will think. And it's not only the users who are affected. And so, for example, if you're developing facial recognition software, then companies that are using facial recognition are your users, and that's how you're kind of optimizing. But facial recognition is something that can be deployed on anyone without consent, and it's a form of biometric identification. So it's massively, there's a potential for a lot of negative harm, not just at the user level, but beyond, to really anyone. So opening up the conversation about AI development and who you're developing it for, to realize that it's not just the users, it can be literally anyone that can be impacted. And in light of that, bringing everyone possible to the table. This goes to what we were saying before, but some specific things that we can do, support Black in AI, support Latinx in AI, support groups that are traditionally underrepresented in technology to come and be part not only of the discussion, but of the development, bring that critical knowledge to the table. And a lot of unintended consequences won't happen because there will be a lot of additional foresight on how things might play out. And sort of to that point, I think incentivizing different kinds of important issues will also really help mitigate some sort of biases and unintended consequences. And so, for example, I hear a lot about hindsight and like learning experiences. I don't see a lot of incentivization of people who work with a lot of foresight and make decisions based on what their foresight is. One of the frustrating things about working in fairness and bias is that you know you've succeeded if there's not a headline. And that's really hard to measure. And so somehow like recognizing people who are making decisions with a lot of thought into how this connects to society, how this connects to civil law and human rights and things like that, and how things might play out over time, avoiding disasters before they even begin, not even going down the path that leads to those disasters, and somehow incentivizing that is really important. That can be done by giving awards for best evaluation, for example, giving awards for most interdisciplinary research papers or diverse author lists, or, you know, there are so many ways we can incentivize these kinds of things, and it's just not being done at all, but I think it would have a huge effect.
Yeah, so when a lot of times, you know, we're both involved in the Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Socio-Technical Systems, and the machine learning community right now is extremely focused on fairness part of that, of the fairness, accountability, transparency, because it's you know, like, so giving the example of the Compass data set, right? So in 2016, ProPublica came up with this article talking about the fact that there was an algorithm being developed by Northpoint, a startup that was being used by judges, and judges were like, so Northpoint is a vendor, and so judges were using it as one of a certain number of factors to determine, you know, someone's likelihood of committing a crime again. And so this can be used to post bail. Your bail amount can be like, you know, tens of thousands of dollars, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, so this article came out, and people in the fairness community are like, oh, yeah. And then so what the ProPublica article was saying was that that this algorithm was biased against Black people. And so then there was like this, you know, discussion, debate about whether or not it was biased and what does it mean to be biased. And there was all this math, and, you know, math is fun. That's why that's why I'm in this field. That's why you're in this field. But and then what started happening, which is why we had Terrence yesterday, and Christiane also wanted to have Terrence, is that, okay, now we have people develop the Compass data set. Okay, and so now they have the Compass data set, so they have abstracted everything to a data set. You don't have to deal with like any of the structural problems or the people involved. So now they have now you have the Compass data set, and now you have paper after paper being like, okay, when we have this type of fairness regularization added to like your classification problem, then we reduce this metric by this percentage on this data set. So the conversation now gets back to that line of thinking. And so now you started having these people getting abstracted more and more away from the real problem, and they have never interacted with people like Terrence, who are actually the victims of this kind of unfairness that the Compass data set is supposed to investigate. And so when you're doing that, what happens is that, you know, you might do some cool math, but you might be going after the entirely wrong problem. Like, you might not be, you know, great, you did X percent, you know, you got X percent better, but you haven't talked to people like Brittney, you haven't talked to people like Terrence, so when you talk to them, they might be like, actually, we can't even implement this, or this is not gonna work, right? So, I mean, this is why it's super important to have this interdisciplinary nature that Meg was talking about. Your point about headlines is interesting, because I think that, yes, it's true that when you don't have headlines is when you're successful. But unfortunately, sometimes we have seen that it is when there are headlines that the companies act. It's super hard to do, like, you're usually going against the current when you're trying to do this kind of work in a corporation, like she said, where you know, it's about the money. And like, you know, Kairos just fired their CEO, who said that he does not want to use face recognition for law enforcement. They fired him from a company that he started himself, because they wanted to go the surveillance route, because that makes you more money. And he said, you know, he's a Black man, and he was like, I'm seeing how this is being used against my community. I don't want to start a company, a face recognition company, for this to be used against my community, and he got fired from his own company because that was not the way to make the most amount of money. So how can we counter that? The way we can counter that is the negative press that comes when you have this kind of products that are released. And so that's what I've seen, like for example, with my work, Joy and I had this paper, we were trying to convince everybody that things were important, and then whatever, it wasn't a big priority, and all of a sudden it's all over the news, and everybody's like, we need to fix this, what's going on, we have to, and then within a month or two, people came up like with, APIs that were better and stuff like that, because they have the resources. So I guess to answer to your question is, I wouldn't overly focus on, there's things we can do with the model. There's a lot of work on these. A lot of people kind of add some regularizer to the loss that, has some notion of fairness. There's things we can do with the data, which is like have a more representative data and stuff like that. But what Meg and I both have been focusing a lot more recently, because we've been hearing from people like Brittney, is give more information about your model, about your data set to different people using it, like policymakers, if I am a startup, a developer, and I have your API, or a publicly released data set, I want to know if this data set is appropriate, like face recognition. I want to know, as law enforcement, should this be used for surveillance? Is it going to unfairly target, like if it makes terrible mistakes, if it mistakes like two black people to each other, it doesn't have that kind of issue for other races. This is encoding discrimination, even if you didn't want to, right? But if you had this information in some sort of documented form, then I could make a decision, be like, oh, I don't want to use that. So that's why we were working on things like data sheets and model cards to give more documentation. You could talk. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, and Timnit has a paper called Data Sheets for Data Sets that goes exactly into how to be transparent about the data sets in a way that people sort of know what they're using. And we also collaborated on a paper called Model Cards for Model Reporting. See how they're cute? They go together. That does this same kind of thing for model. And that's not fairness, that's now transparency. And transparency is a mechanism for accountability and for people to be able to pursue justice if necessary. And also for general customers to sort of know what they're getting and compare and things like that. So yeah, I think I'm kind of babbling, but I just completely agree. And transparency is a really important part of this.
We wouldn't have written these kinds of papers if we weren't communicating with people like you, right? So Brittney was talking. She was like, transparency is the most important thing.
Right.
And with transparency, it's kind of even different from interpretability.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
so
yeah.
That's a different.
Well, there's post hoc interpretability, which can be used. Yeah, but. Yeah.
No, that's, yeah.
So, yeah, a lot of answer. Yeah, so for you, what are the timelines involved in the search for a fair AI? When do you think it will be really fair? And is it achievable? Do you think it's achievable? Or it's just theoretically possible?
So your question is, when do we think AI is going to be fair, and is it ever going to happen? Is that kind of the question?
It's tough.
Okay, well.
I think we can make AI more diverse and inclusive. And so I like to make a bit of a distinction between fairness and inclusion, where in fairness, a lot of the times we're talking about different kind of error rates and things like that. And getting some sort of equality between them, whereas in inclusion, we're talking about increasing the capabilities for a lot of different options that would not be considered offhand by people developing it. So to give a very concrete example of what I mean by this, as I started at Microsoft Research, where I worked before Google, they were just completing the COCO data set, and they were making the decisions of what to include in the COCO data set, and they had things that would be used, by everyone, like baseball and baseball bat and baseball glove and baseball hat. And they threw away things that weren't that common, like necklace. And I was just thinking, like, you guys see what you're doing, right? Like, but it really wasn't part of the conversation, right? Because you just kind of get into this groupthink myopia. And so I think that that what will happen is more inclusion and more diversity. We're going to open up capabilities to include the thoughts and considerations and priorities of people who have traditionally been underrepresented, and and Timnit in particular is single-handedly changing the face of AI to make that so. It's in a really amazing way. And so I hope that this is what we see more of. So I think that is achievable and is starting to be more and more achieved. I think that there is always other ways to define fairness, and so I don't think I will say we will never get to a position where most people agree this is fair. There are lots of types of fairness, and we can get to places where lots of people agree on specific aspects of what is unfair. Also to your point that you made earlier. When we go to panels and stuff, we largely just agree with one another, so it's kind of boring. Just ditto, ditto, ditto. Yeah, but I think that we can get to technology that is more diverse and inclusive. I don't think we will ever get to a point where everyone says this is fair technology.
I mean, all I would just say on this piece is that, I think the source of anxiety for a lot of people is very much tied to what Meg said about the pressure to launch, is that, obviously, people are not waiting to deploy these technologies until we're certain that they're fair. So there's this real pressure to figure out how to deal with that. And one of the ways it's manifested itself in New York is that in 2018, the City Council passed a bill that established a task force on automated decision systems. And so the task force is now looking at some of these questions, at least as far as government application of the technologies.
Yeah, I just can't imagine getting into a world where we're saying AI is fair. Like, we also have to get to a world where we say the world is fair. Like, when is that going to happen? I can't imagine that happening. I think we can make it more fair, less biased. We can mitigate. So that's why we always talk about mitigating bias, right? We don't like the term unbiased, because a lot of people say, we want to unbias this, we want to unbias that.
Or de-bias.
De-bias is another one. It's because, I think the reason we came here in the first place, we got to this point, is because we're abstracting things too much. We've moved to a place where we have a data set and numbers and this, and then we launch either a paper or a product. And what we need to understand is the complexity of everything. And so if we just say, hey, you have now tested this fairness metric, that fairness metric, that fairness metric on this data set is ready to launch, is de-biased. I don't think that's a good way to go about it either. It's just kind of giving more you can try to mitigate the bias, but also try to give more documentation about which areas you also think it's going to still be biased, and kind of have this conversation. I can't imagine getting into a world where anything is fair. Sorry, I don't mean to be, pessimistic, but the world is complex, and so there's one group or another who's always going to be discriminated against or something. And then even cars, you mentioned data sheets for data sets. We had we talk about other industries where these kinds of issues happened, right? So in cars and automobiles, when people were testing automobiles, they only tested them on dummies with prototypical adult male characteristics. And so then you find that accidents were disproportionately affecting women and children. Okay, so then maybe you fix that problem. Right now in speech recognition, we even have groups of people. You wouldn't say that maybe societally they might not even be discriminated against, but in our data set, we might not train with a lot of data set kids, for example. So you can create things that are now discriminating against children, even if your society is not really necessarily discriminating against children, right? So it's very complex, and so I think we can just try to address different pieces of it, but I don't think we can say in 5 years we'll get to a point where, or X number of years where it's, fair.
Okay, thank you. So I have a lot of questions, but I will let the audience ask their own questions. So if you want to...
I think there's a mic over there for questions. Oh,
yeah,
there you could ask, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there is. The microphone is missing. But so if you want to ask a question, go to the microphone.
Hello? Does this one work?
Yeah, oh, I'm good. Yeah.
All right, is this microphone working? Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I mean, Brittney and I have talked in the past about kind of structural sort of things in housing discrimination and so forth, gentrification, and the conversation so far has been all focused on kind of the algorithmic decision-making, the allocations and so forth, but what we haven't talked about are what are ways machine learning and artificial intelligence can actually help societal issues, so maybe you guys can comment on that a little bit. Thanks.
Sure. So I have folks who were in the session that I was part of in Black and AI yesterday will have heard this already, but it might be helpful or instructive to other folks. So one of, like an example of how we've tried to, at least at the city level, kind of apply these technologies in a positive way, is that one of the categories of protection under the city human rights law is lawful source of income, meaning that you cannot be discriminated against in the housing market because you use a voucher to pay for your housing. And yet we still see a lot of it across the city. And one of the projects that we did was we worked with our partners at the Mayor's Office for Data Analytics, who are also represented here, developed a model to help us predict areas in the city where there were large numbers of vacant units, and where those units were relatively affordable, and where they were in neighborhoods that, because of, how schools were ranked or whatever it might be, would be attractive to folks. And so we then identified those neighborhoods, and that became a way for the commission to look and to see, okay, well, maybe we need to focus some more of our testing resources here. Maybe these are places where we need to do more outreach and education and talk to people and see if they've been experiencing source of income discrimination. So that's kind of one way in which I think it can be helpful.
I can give a couple of examples. Like, for example, you can use machine learning to uncover bias, right? Like, there is work showing that performance reviews have gender biases. So that's one way. There's work showing that Oakland police speak less respectfully to Black people when they stop them, and that's an NLP, and that's a huge collaboration with people in NLP and stuff like that. So there's a lot of work doing this, and I even have hope that maybe things like the hiring practices could even help us uncover bias. It's just that we're all like machine learning, but it's just that it needs to be done in a framework where it allows us to have checks and balances. Do you want to say something?
I'll just quickly say also assistive technology.
Yes, see, I mean, Meg Mitchell has us seeing AI.
And Anirudh actually presented earlier, yes.
Thank you very much for a great panel. My name is Luke Stark. I'm a postdoc here at Microsoft Research Montreal, and I say that because I work every day with engineers and researchers in AI, and I am absolutely 100% with you on the need for greater diversity and inclusion in the tech sector, in AI research, but I want to ask a sort of more conceptual question about work in tech and the kind of evidence that people in tech need to not develop a system. Because we talk a lot about social reasons and philosophical reasons to not develop systems, but I think sometimes there's a sense that, we can fix all those problems if we come up with the right technical solution. And so I wonder what you all think about how to talk about evidence and how to present evidence that convinces technologists.
Yeah, I want to speak to this because I'm working on this very directly. So one thing that does help is activism. To Timnit's point earlier, market pressures are oftentimes going to be different than what activists can achieve, and so if you can drive a very clear narrative around right and wrong, like Joy Bulamwini does an amazing job at this, and drive headlines, to Timnit's point earlier, that can make huge changes. Another thing to think about is just being very clear about the pros and cons of things. Companies more and more like Microsoft and Google, probably some of the other big tech companies are thinking about benefits and risks in terms of ethics, in part because this is a thing that is sort of popular now. And so it's a great time to get in information about risks and benefits around things that could possibly be controversial or problematic. So for example, gender detection, good or bad? Like, companies will not have a very clear idea about this necessarily, and to the extent that people generally can articulate the risks, the benefits, make that clear how it might be used, that's something that companies will be very responsive to, at least now, because they'd like to know, you know? They want to also know where their market opportunities are. So just being very clear about different kinds of risks and benefits and activism as well is super, super important.
Sorry about that. I am much shorter. I was wondering, what are the different ways that you all have thought about to help us continue to pursue or convince our companies to continue to pursue AI ethics? Because a lot of times, you know, we do see how it's sometimes reactionary against like any negative headlines. I think a lot of our companies have figured out like diversity and inclusion is good for different things, but what are ways that we can like show the more, I don't know, financial incentives on the bottom line, those types of things, just sort of like translate this into numbers, basically.
I can take a stab at it. I haven't figured it out. Like, honestly, it's really hard. I mean, even diversity and inclusion, like in name, yes, everybody talks about it. It's all the time. This and that, money and sessions. But
in practice,
reality,
nothing
no.
changes. Nothing changes.
Yeah, it's in practice, you know, it's just so hard to change a culture. And so, you know, what we try to do is like build coalitions. I think that's, I mean, really, because just to show that there are a whole bunch of people who, Meredith Whittaker is amazing at this at Google. So the whole anti-Maven activism happened because of Meredith Whittaker. So like there's a whole coalition of people who are against something. So that's one thing I figured out that helps. But in terms of even diversity and inclusion, there's all of this research showing that it's better for business, it's better for boards and whatever. And now everybody has figured out that they should say that they like diversity and inclusion. That's what happened. They've all figured out that they should say that. But in practice, things are not changing, actually. You look at the numbers. You know, women leave at higher rates and all this stuff. And when you look at the culture, you understand why. But it's really hard to change the culture.
Unfortunately, the majority does not seem to understand why.
I don't know. I mean, it's really hard. And so in terms of ethics, I'm worried that now people have similarly figured out that they should say they care about ethics. But then when it comes down to it, it's all of these things are going against the grain. You're fighting against the current of what has happened forever, right? And so these individual, so gender detection now. So Meg worked really hard on trying to figure out why not and all that stuff. So like really good documentation and then building coalitions. But unfortunately, I don't have a better thing to say. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I definitely don't have the answer on that one. I'm just aggressively taking notes here and listening to you all.
I mean, it is super, I'm gonna have to tell you, like, I wanna be honest, it's exhausting. It's just, it feels like you're always fighting.
Yeah, and no one says good job. No,
you're always fighting. You know, you're telling that person.
Say good job.
You're telling that person, like Meg always like, don't launch your product. There's issues. Don't launch that thing you were super excited about for months, you know? And then like, you were doing something wrong. Like, this is what you're saying all the time. It's super exhausting because I also want to be the popular person that people like, you know? It's not because, I don't know.
So we are running out of time, so maybe you can ask your question back to back and then they can try to answer. So
all right, sounds good. So my question is about the secret sauce of AI. I mean, any company has to like, hold their trade secret to prevent competition, right? That's the enemy. And do you feel like there should be regulation against this for the sake of fairness? Or what regulation would you like to see?
So I think that, sorry, I was really excited.
So in philosophy of science, recently people distinguish between two kinds of diversity, epistemic diversity and demographic diversity. And I think this kind of distinction sometimes really help us to say what do we mean exactly by diversity, and especially when we want to devise some strategies, like in practice. And I was wondering if in tech industry also you think that drawing this kind of distinction, more fine-grained distinction, is necessary, or whether you have this distinction already.
Final question. This follows on from your question, actually. There was a memo that the RAND Corporation put out in the 60s when they were trying to figure out how to hire programmers. And they said that there was a gift and a curse of hiring programmers because the best ones, many would do what they were told, but very few would not do what they were told. And so they had this great wealth of labor, but labor that wouldn't always think creatively in the way that they needed to make serious progress. And I wonder what you would make of that characterization, if that remains the case. That was a long time ago. And simultaneously, whether, in medicine we have doctors and nurses, and the doctor, as a tradition will try and, push research forward, and the nurses will help conform what we know to what you want. You may not want to keep living. Do you think we're actually missing a whole labor category here, a professional class of people that help conform these kind of large-scale autonomous systems to hyper-local ethical needs of different places?
Yeah, I'll say very quickly that I think on that last question, I think I don't know the extent to which this is a thing that industry is thinking about, but like bringing some of this expertise in-house in a bigger, kind of deeper investment way definitely seems advisable to me.
Yeah, so I guess my quick response to all three questions is that I think that there needs to be bridging work between engineers and other kinds of agencies, and so like regulators. And so it's not so good to regulate necessarily if you don't know how the machine learning works, because then you might do something that actually works against what your overall goal is. On the other hand, like you might be doing something as an engineer that you really shouldn't be doing. And so bridging work to help translate, know what the questions are on both sides, what regulators might ask of engineers and what engineers might ask of regulators, helping drive that conversation would be really useful. I guess now I just went back to answering mostly the first question because I really liked it, but the other questions are also really good. All right, thank you.
Do you want to say something about the philosophy thing?
Oh, no, you can.
Oh no, because I'm not the philosophy person here. You are. Okay. Well, I don't know the answer to. I don't like a lot of times, in my opinion, in the tech industry, when people are trying to say, when you were saying like you don't have diverse X type of diversity, but then we say, but we have Y type of diversity and Z. It's usually a way to deflect things. So that's the way I've seen it happen. It's like, well, you don't have any demographic diversity, but we have intellectual diversity,
Right,
and
yeah.
you always hear this kind of stuff, and I think personally it's been used to deflect things, is my opinion. On your question about people being told what to do, I feel like the education system, the CS educational system, is partly what brought us here, and I really like. I'm going to talk about the paper. The moral character of cryptographic work is like this paper that I would really recommend everybody reads, because Philip Brockway is a professor, and he said that the failure to prevent mass surveillance is really, it falls on the cryptographic community, because they've just abstracted out any sort of social understanding or whatever from the work. It's like Alice and Bob are trying to communicate, and there's some adversary. Well, who's Alice? Who's Bob? Who's the adversary? That means everything. And so it's like a 40-something page paper, and I think we need that kind of paper for machine learning. And he talks about how nuclear physicists were really active in nuclear disarmament and all this stuff. And he also talks about how when computer scientists were being asked in why they're choosing different companies to go to, nobody really thought about morality and things like that. A lot of them are like, well, weather, money, things like this. And so we have this concept where, well, my job is this as an engineer, partly because it's much easier maybe and more fun to just think about your job in this particular model or developing this thing, and you don't think about, well, what is my responsibility in the overall company or in the overall institution that I'm working with and what they're developing, because I think that's much more difficult and more complex and not necessarily fun, actually. That's not why we got into this field, right? I didn't get into this field to start Black in AI. Like, I said I wanted to be a scientist when I was little. That was not what I had in mind. So these are not the reasons we get into these fields, but I agree that even our educational system, it rewards us for doing exactly what we're told to do. You go to a class, you're told this homework, you do this homework in this exact specific way, and that's the only way you're going to get an A. So we haven't really been taught how to not do what we're not, told to do.
So thank you very much to our three panelists. Let's... Good job.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for good job moderating.
Yes.
It's at 5:43.